100 photos of slavery that will haunt you forever. History is filled with stories of resilience, struggle, and untold truths. From enslaved people seeking freedom to convict laborers and war prisoners, each image reveals a past that shaped our world. What were their lives like? How did they endure? This collection of powerful moments, from the horrors of slavery to the fight for justice, uncovers forgotten voices and hidden narratives. This photograph shows Harriet Tubman, alongside a group of people she helped escape from slavery. Born into slavery in 1822, Tubman escaped in 1849 and became a key conductor on the Underground Railroad. She risked her life repeatedly, leading about 70 enslaved individuals to freedom while never losing a single person under her care. This 1838 reward poster from Bardstown, Kentucky, offers $150 for the capture of a runaway enslaved person. Such notices were widespread, often providing detailed descriptions to aid in recapture. The high reward reflects how enslaved individuals were viewed as valuable property, with their freedom met by relentless pursuit. This 1865 photograph shows the interior of a slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia. These facilities were used to detain enslaved people before they were sold at auction. As a major hub for the domestic slave trade, Alexandria saw thousands of men, women, and children pass through such pens, enduring inhumane conditions while awaiting their fate. This 1865 photo from Bahia, Brazil, shows a man being carried by two enslaved men, a stark illustration of the country's entrenched slave system. Brazil, the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, relied heavily on enslaved labor for centuries. Scenes like this were common, highlighting the deep social and economic divide that persisted until the end of slavery. This 1889 photo captures an African-American man being whipped inside a U.S. prison, a grim reminder that slavery's end in 1865 didn't mean true freedom. The prison system, especially in the South, became a new form of control, forcing many black men into hard labor and subjecting them to brutal punishments. Harsh conditions were the norm, and many formerly enslaved people found themselves behind bars for minor or fabricated offenses. Five generations of an enslaved family on Smith's plantation, Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1862. The photograph captures the resilience of enslaved families despite generations of bondage. Although the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in 1863, true freedom for many would only come with the Union victory in 1865. This 1850 portrait shows Renty, an enslaved man in South Carolina, photographed by Harvard professor Louis Agassiz. Agassiz promoted pseudoscientific racial theories like polygenism, which falsely claimed that different races were biologically separate and that Africans were inferior. Images like this weren't just portraits, they were tools used to justify oppression under the guise of science. At 107 years old, former slave Jack Riddle and his 86-year-old wife Josie received a Christmas gift, a radio, from an unlikely source, the Ku Klux Klan. On the surface, it might seem like a kind gesture, but there's a disturbing irony here. This 1902 photo from Wyndham Prison, Western Australia, shows Aboriginal people chained together, a stark reminder of their brutal treatment. Deprived of freedom and dignity, they were often seen as inferior and subjected to harsh conditions. Beyond imprisonment, government policies sought to civilize them, stripping away their culture and autonomy in the process. This 1860 photograph features Andrew Chandler alongside Silas Chandler, who was formerly enslaved. During the Civil War, Silas traveled with Andrew and is said to have saved his life at the Battle of Chickamauga. After the war, Andrew reportedly gave Silas land, where he later built a church. However, like many enslaved men forced to accompany their enslavers, Silas's story is complex, shaped by a system that denied him true freedom. In this 1907 photo, a British sailor removes shackles from a Swahili man who had been bound for 3 years. This took place during a British campaign to dismantle the Indian Ocean slave trade near Mozambique. The Royal Navy patrolled these waters, intercepting slave ships in an effort to curb the brutal practice that had persisted for centuries. In 1863, a group of light-skinned enslaved children in New Orleans were photographed. Despite looking white, they were legally classified as black under the one-drop rule. These images weren't just portraits, they were powerful tools used to highlight the injustices of slavery and rally support for schools that helped newly freed people build a future. In this photo, Jesse L. Birch and Frank M. Rockwell sit on either side of an African-American woman, with Birch appearing to aim his gun at her head. Images like this were common, serving as a display of dominance and intimidation over black individuals. While the full story behind this picture remains unclear, the woman is believed to be a suspect, and the men are thought to be law enforcement officers. Regardless of the context, the image reflects a history where power was often asserted through fear. Jonathan Walker, famously known as the man with the branded hand, was an abolitionist who risked everything to help enslaved people escape. In 1844, he was caught and convicted for assisting 7 individuals in their bid for freedom. As punishment, authorities branded his hand with the letters SS for slave stealer. Instead of silencing him, this brutal act made Walker a powerful symbol of resistance against slavery. In this 1911 photo, Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madam C.J. Walker, proudly drives her car. Born to formerly enslaved parents, she defied the odds to build a thriving beauty empire. At her peak, her wealth would equal around $40 million today. But Walker was more than a successful entrepreneur. She was also a passionate advocate for civil rights, using her influence to uplift others. This is the bell rack, a cruel device designed to stop enslaved people from escaping. It was strapped around the neck and sometimes the waist, with a metal bar holding a bell on top. Any movement would set off the bell, making it nearly impossible to run without being heard. This photo shows a Union soldier posing with a young boy referred to as contraband, a term used for enslaved people who sought refuge with Union forces during the Civil War. Many soldiers developed deep connections with these individuals, and some went on to advocate for African American rights after the war. While the term itself reflected the dehumanizing reality of slavery, for many, it marked the first step toward freedom. This 1898 photograph features Lucy Higgs Nichols, a formerly enslaved woman who made history as the only female member of the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, a Civil War veterans organization. Escaping slavery during the war, she served as a nurse for Union troops. Years later, her dedication was honored with official recognition in the GAR, a rare distinction for a black woman in that era. This late 19th century photo from Brazil captures an enslaved woman playing with her master's child. Enslaved women were often tasked with raising their enslavers' children, forming close bonds despite the brutal reality of their status. While these children saw them as caregivers in their early years, they were also raised to accept slavery as normal, growing up to view the very people who nurtured them as mere property. This 1890 photograph from Zanzibar, then a British protectorate, captures a young enslaved boy forced to hold a heavy log over his head as punishment. Though slavery in Zanzibar was officially abolished in 1897, countless individuals endured brutal treatment under the system. This harrowing image shows Africans captured aboard a slave ship, many appearing weak and malnourished. Such conditions were typical during the brutal transatlantic crossing, where disease, starvation, and abuse claimed countless lives. Over more than 3 centuries, an estimated 12 to 15 million people were forcibly taken from their homelands, enduring unimaginable suffering in one of history's darkest chapters. This photo shows Samuel Phillips Verner alongside Africans he brought to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Verner labeled them as pygmies, capitalizing on public fascination with African cultures. This powerful image captures a man who was brutally branded by his enslaver, with an initial carved into his forehead. He wears a metal collar designed to inflict pain and control movement. This image depicts Anastasia wearing an iron mask, one of many brutal devices used to punish enslaved people in Brazil. These masks were designed to prevent speaking and eating, serving as tools of control and dehumanization. This 1880 photograph captures sugarcane cutters in Jamaica, laboring in one of the island's most important industries. Many of these workers were descendants of enslaved Africans. Although slavery was abolished in 1834, harsh conditions persisted, as many formerly enslaved people remained tied to plantation labor with limited opportunities for economic independence. During World War II, American prisoners of war captured by the Japanese were subjected to brutal forced labor under inhumane conditions. Many were sent to work on the Burma Railway, also known as the Death Railway, where they endured extreme mistreatment, malnutrition, and disease. Thousands perished due to the harsh conditions and relentless forced labor. In this 1852 photograph, farmers wait for the opening of a slave market in St. Louis, Missouri. Enslaved people were treated as commodities, displayed, and sold to the highest bidder. St. Louis was a key hub for the domestic slave trade, with its location on the Mississippi River, making it a prime destination for traders transporting enslaved individuals across the South. Villa Americana, founded by former Confederates in Brazil, became a refuge for about 10,000 Southerners who left the U.S. after the Civil War. Seeking to preserve their way of life, including slavery, which was still legal in Brazil at the time, they established a community that retained many Southern traditions. Today, descendants of these Confederates still live in the region, preserving elements of their ancestors' culture. The ruins of a slave cabin, seen here in 2012, remain on a former plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina. This site was part of the Combahee River Raid, a daring military operation led by Harriet Tubman in 1863, which freed more than 750 enslaved people and struck a major blow against the Confederacy. Sharecroppers picking cotton in Georgia in 1898. After slavery, sharecropping became the dominant labor system in the South. Black farmers worked land owned by white landowners in exchange for a portion of the harvest. However, the system kept many in a cycle of debt and poverty, as costs for supplies, food, and housing often exceeded their earnings. This 1907 photograph shows an Arab slave trader in custody aboard HMS Sphinx off the coast of Mozambique. The Royal Navy actively patrolled these waters to disrupt the East African slave trade, capturing traffickers and liberating those who had been enslaved. These efforts were part of Britain's broader campaign to end slavery in the region. The 4th United States Colored Infantry was one of many regiments established after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. In total, approximately 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, playing a crucial role in the fight for freedom and the Union's victory. Enslaved Africans harvest cotton under the watchful eye of an overseer, a familiar sight on southern plantations. Cotton was one of the most profitable crops of the era, and enslaved laborers endured grueling hours in the fields to fuel the economy. Taken in Baton Rouge in April 1863, this powerful photograph shows Gordon, a formerly enslaved man, with deep scars from brutal whippings. Known as the scourged back, the image became a defining symbol of the horrors of slavery, widely circulated by abolitionists to expose its cruelty and rally support for the cause. Thomas Mundy Peterson made history as the first African American to vote under the 15th Amendment. On March 31, 1870, he cast his ballot in a local election in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, marking a significant milestone in the fight for black suffrage in the United States. HMS Daphne played a crucial role in Britain's anti-slavery efforts, rescuing over 100 enslaved people in early November 1868. These individuals had been captured by traffickers in the Indian Ocean and were freed during a Royal Navy operation. The first photograph captures them shortly after their rescue, still bearing the signs of their ordeal. In the second image, they are seen in new clothing, symbolizing their transition to freedom. Many of the rescued individuals were later resettled in British colonies in East Africa. This photo shows African American teenagers held in Florida's convict leasing system. After slavery was abolished, many black individuals were arrested for minor offenses like vagrancy and forced into hard labor. This system became a way to continue exploiting black labor and maintaining racial control long after emancipation. Omar ibn Said, a learned Islamic scholar from Senegal, was captured and enslaved in the United States. Before his enslavement, he was highly respected for his knowledge. Forced into bondage, he spent over 50 years in captivity, leaving behind writings that offer a rare first-hand account of an enslaved Muslim in America. In this 1910 photo, a convict leasing gang rests after a day of road construction. Prisoners were transported in barred wagons, allowing easy relocation to different work sites. The convict leasing system, which disproportionately targeted African Americans, continued the exploitation of forced labor long after the abolition of slavery. This 1862 photograph captures enslaved people abandoned by Confederate General Thomas F. Drayton. As Union forces advanced, many enslaved individuals were left behind by retreating Confederates. In such cases, the Union Army often provided protection, and some formerly enslaved people took the opportunity to join the Union war effort, either as laborers or soldiers in the United States colored troops. This 1897 photograph captures contract laborers in Delhi, Indonesia, sorting tobacco leaves under the watch of a Dutch overseer. The region's booming tobacco industry relied heavily on exploited labor under harsh conditions. The slave market in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1864 was one of many where African Americans were bought and sold as property. These markets were central to the Southern economy. When Union forces occupied Atlanta later that year, many of these markets were dismantled, signaling the collapse of the Confederacy's slave-based system. This photograph shows Rebecca Latimer Felton alongside two politicians, just a day before she became the first woman to serve in the U.S. Senate. While breaking barriers for women in politics, Felton was also the last former enslaver to hold a Senate seat and openly promoted white supremacy, highlighting the deep contradictions in her legacy. Taken in April 1939, this photo captures Willis Wynn, a formerly enslaved man, holding the horn once used to call enslaved workers to the fields. At the time, Wynn claimed to be 116 years old, serving as a living link to a painful past. This 1947 photograph captures Mrs. Sally Smith, an 88-year-old formerly enslaved woman, observing the Emancipation Proclamation. Though slavery had formally ended decades earlier, her life remained shaped by the lasting effects of oppression and discrimination. This 1863 photograph shows enslaved people and workers taking a midday break on a Cuban plantation. At the time, Cuba's economy was deeply reliant on enslaved labor, particularly in the sugar and tobacco industries. As one of the last Spanish colonies to abolish slavery, Cuba officially ended the practice in 1886, but the legacy of forced labor remained for years. An enslaved person cooking in a cast-iron pot while a child watches. Enslaved people's diets were often limited to basic staples like cornmeal, beans, and salted pork. Despite harsh conditions, cooking remained a way to preserve African culinary traditions and sustain their communities. A group of contrabands at the Allen Farm near Yorktown, Virginia. Enslaved people who fled Confederate territories sought refuge with Union forces. Commanders classified them as contraband of war, meaning they were not returned to their enslavers and were instead given protection, with some joining the Union war effort. This image depicts enslaved people working on a coffee plantation in Brazil's Paraíba Valley. Coffee production was a driving force in Brazil's economy, and enslaved laborers were essential to every stage, from planting to harvesting and processing. The brutal conditions on these plantations reflected the deep entrenchment of slavery in Brazil, which was the last country in the Americas to abolish the practice in 1888. This 1887 photograph captures the Shores family in Custer County, Nebraska. Rachel and Jerry Shores, formerly enslaved, were among the many African Americans who sought new opportunities in the West after emancipation. As pioneers, they contributed to the development of the American frontier, demonstrating resilience and determination in building a new life. During the Civil War, many black men who escaped slavery joined the Union Army, fighting with extraordinary courage. Despite their bravery, they were initially paid less than white soldiers. After persistent protests and advocacy, Congress granted equal pay in 1864, recognizing their vital contributions to the war effort. Miss Wyoming Joyce McKinney was arrested in 1977 for kidnapping Mormon missionary Kirk Anderson in England. She allegedly held him captive for 3 days in a remote cottage. The bizarre case attracted widespread media attention due to its sensational details and McKinney's eccentric behavior. A church service celebrating the signing of the Lei Aurea, Golden Law, which abolished slavery in Brazil. Signed by Princess Isabel on May 13, 1888, the law marked the official end of slavery in the country, making Brazil the last nation in the Americas to abolish the practice. This 1916 photograph shows formerly enslaved women attending a convention in Washington, D.C. These gatherings served as spaces for sharing personal stories, advocating for civil rights, and celebrating freedom. This 1862 photograph captures enslaved people on J.J. Smith's plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Like many southern cotton plantations, Smith's operation depended entirely on enslaved labor. The Union occupation of the region during the Civil War led to the liberation of many enslaved people, transforming the plantation economy. What if everything you thought you knew about white women in the antebellum South was wrong? Rather than being passive figures, they were active players in the slave economy, co-conspirators who bought, sold, and owned enslaved people. Astonishingly, nearly 40% of slave owners were white women, and their power grew with each enslaved person they controlled. For these women, owning slaves became intertwined with their identity, often taking precedence over land ownership. Discover the untold stories of how white women navigated and shaped the brutal reality of slavery, revealing a complex legacy of power and complicity. The hidden abuse, black male slaves, and elite white women. While the horrors of slavery are well documented, including the sexual exploitation of black women by white slave owners, a lesser-known aspect is the abuse suffered by black men at the hands of elite white women. We need to shine a light on this hidden chapter to fully understand the brutality of the system. We often hear about the planter class, the wealthy white men who owned vast plantations and controlled the lives of enslaved people. But what about the women in this elite class? These planter class white women enjoyed a privileged position in Southern society, benefiting directly from the forced labor of enslaved individuals. While their husbands held legal ownership over the enslaved population, these women wielded significant power within the plantation household. They were responsible for managing the domestic sphere, including overseeing the work of enslaved people assigned to household duties. This position of authority, combined with the pervasive racism of the time, created an environment ripe for abuse. It's important to remember that enslaved individuals had no legal protections against any form of violence or exploitation. They were seen as property, not human beings with rights. This made black men particularly vulnerable to the whims of planter-class white women, who could inflict physical and psychological harm without fear of consequences. Historians are increasingly uncovering evidence of this abuse. Stories of beatings, sexual assault, and psychological torment inflicted by white women on enslaved black men. These accounts often remain hidden in the shadows, buried in diaries, court records, and whispered family histories. Unmasking the antebellum era. Let's journey back to a pivotal period in American history, the antebellum era. This term, meaning before the war, refers to the decades leading up to the Civil War, roughly from the end of the War of 1812 to 1861. It was a time of immense change and growth for the young nation, with factories springing up, settlers pushing westward, and the economy transforming. But beneath this surface of progress lay a dark and brutal reality: slavery. The antebellum South was built on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants, who were forced to toil in fields and endure unimaginable hardships. Initially, many in the South saw slavery as a necessary evil, a temporary system they hoped would eventually fade away. However, as the demand for cotton and other crops exploded, the South's dependence on slave labor only deepened. Something truly disturbing happened as the antebellum era progressed. Southern leaders, intellectuals, and even some religious figures began to actively defend slavery. They twisted their arguments, claiming that it wasn't just necessary, but actually a positive good for both enslavers and the enslaved. This justification was used to silence growing opposition to slavery, especially from the newly formed abolitionist movement. The internal slave trade also boomed during this time. The U.S. had outlawed the importation of enslaved people from Africa, making those already in the country incredibly valuable. Farmers in older states like Virginia saw an opportunity to profit by selling enslaved individuals to plantations further south and west, tearing families apart and fueling the expansion of slavery into new territories. While most Southern farmers owned only a few enslaved people, the wealthy elite controlled vast plantations with hundreds of enslaved individuals. Their wealth and influence translated into significant political power, shaping the South's economy and society. The antebellum era was marked by intense political debates. States' rights, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the growing divide between the North and South created a powder keg ready to explode. These tensions ultimately erupted into the Civil War, a conflict that would forever change the course of American history. They were her property. White women as active participants in slavery. For a long time, the historical narrative around slavery often portrayed white women as passive bystanders, sheltered from the harsh realities of the system. However, historian Stephanie Jones Rogers challenges this view in her groundbreaking book, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Jones Rogers argues that white women were far from passive. They were active and willing participants in slavery, using it to build their own economic power and social standing. Her research draws on a powerful source often overlooked by previous historians: interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted during the Great Depression. These first-hand accounts reveal a very different picture of white women's involvement in slavery. Jones Rogers discovered that white girls were often trained from a young age to be slave owners. They received lessons in slave management and discipline, and some were even allowed to inflict physical punishment on enslaved individuals. Imagine this: young girls receiving enslaved people as gifts, sometimes as young as 9 months old. These children grew up seeing other human beings as their personal property, a deeply disturbing reality. One particularly striking example comes from a court record where a woman recounts how her grandfather gave her an enslaved person as her own when she was just 9 months old. This demonstrates how deeply ingrained the concept of slave ownership was in Southern society, even influencing the lives of infants. As these girls grew into women, they carried this sense of entitlement and ownership with them. They actively participated in buying, selling, and managing enslaved people, often with great brutality. This wasn't just about economic gain. It was about asserting their power and dominance within a system built on racial hierarchy. Jones Rogers' work forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about white women's complicity in slavery. It challenges us to reevaluate the traditional narrative and acknowledge the role they played in perpetuating this brutal system. By understanding the full extent of their involvement, we can gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of slavery and its lasting impact on American society. We must also recognize the resilience and resistance of enslaved people who endured unimaginable cruelty at the hands of both white men and women. By acknowledging these difficult truths, we can work towards a more honest and complete understanding of our history, and strive for a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. Power, gender, and exploitation. Slavery was a complex system that went beyond racial oppression. It also reinforced gender hierarchies, shaping the roles and power dynamics of both men and women within Southern society. While planter-class white women were expected to conform to societal norms of femininity, they wielded considerable power within the confines of slavery. These women were not simply passive bystanders. They actively participated in upholding the institution. They managed households, oversaw enslaved laborers, and even held legal ownership over enslaved individuals. Let's pause and consider this for a moment. In the antebellum South, white women were denied basic rights that we take for granted today. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold public office, and their property became their husbands upon marriage. Yet, they possessed the power to buy, sell, and own other human beings, a stark illustration of the twisted logic of slavery. This ownership granted them immense authority over enslaved people, including black men. They could dictate their daily routines, issue punishments, and even control their access to food and basic necessities. This power dynamic created an environment where abuse could flourish, hidden behind the facade of Southern gentility. Understanding the role of planter-class white women in perpetuating slavery is crucial to understanding the full scope of its brutality. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that women, too, were complicit in this system of oppression, using their power to inflict harm on those deemed less than human. By acknowledging this often overlooked aspect of slavery, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of its impact on individuals and society as a whole. Unraveling the motivation. Why did they abuse? Understanding the motivations behind the sexual abuse of enslaved black men by elite white women is a complex and challenging task. While there's no single answer, exploring potential factors can shed light on this disturbing aspect of history. It's possible that some women engaged in this abuse out of boredom or sexual frustration. However, it's also likely that at least on a subconscious level, it served as a means of compensating for their own lack of power within the patriarchal structure of Southern society. Planter-class women were essentially considered the property of their husbands, with limited control over their own lives and bodies. They lacked the same freedoms and opportunities afforded to men. Sexually exploiting enslaved individuals could have been a way for them to exert power and control in a world where they felt powerless. It's important to emphasize that this is not an attempt to excuse or justify their actions. Sexual abuse is never acceptable, regardless of the perpetrator's motivations. However, by examining the social and psychological context in which these abuses occurred, we can gain a deeper understanding of the factors that may have contributed to them. Planter-class women faced numerous restrictions on their freedom and mobility. They were often confined to the plantation, expected to uphold a strict code of conduct, and subjected to their husband's authority in nearly every aspect of their lives. Many were deeply unhappy with their lack of autonomy and the double standard that allowed their husbands to engage in extramarital affairs and sexual exploitation of enslaved women, while they were expected to remain silent and subservient. Historian Catherine Clinton describes these women as prisoners in disguise, highlighting their constrained lives and limited options. Knowing that their husbands fathered children with enslaved women was a source of humiliation and pain for many planter-class wives. This powerlessness, combined with the societal pressures to maintain a facade of respectability, may have led some women to seek a sense of control through the sexual exploitation of enslaved men. It's crucial to remember that this is just one possible explanation. The motivations behind these acts were likely complex and varied. However, by exploring the interplay of power, gender, and societal expectations, we can begin to unravel the dark history of abuse within the antebellum South and gain a more complete understanding of the human cost of slavery. Sexual exploitation, a weapon of power and control. One of the most disturbing aspects of the abuse suffered by black male slaves was sexual exploitation by elite white women. While the dominant narrative often portrays these women as innocent victims of the patriarchal system, the reality is far more complex. Some actively engaged in non-consensual sexual relationships with enslaved men, exploiting their power and control in ways that inflicted immense harm. Harriet Jacobs, a formerly enslaved woman, provides a powerful example in her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She describes how some planters' daughters would deliberately choose enslaved men for sexual relationships, often selecting those who were most vulnerable and least likely to resist. Jacobs's account reveals a pattern of predatory behavior where these women used their position of authority to coerce enslaved men into sexual acts. These encounters cannot be considered consensual in any meaningful sense of the word. They were acts of sexual abuse, and in many cases, rape. It's important to recognize that planter-class white women, just like their male counterparts, had the power to sexually control and abuse enslaved people. They could use their position to demand sexual favors, and if those demands were refused, they could threaten to accuse the enslaved men of rape or attempted rape. This tactic was particularly insidious because it weaponized the very system designed to protect white women: patriarchy. By portraying themselves as vulnerable and in need of protection, they could manipulate white men into punishing enslaved black men, even if the accusations were false. These acts of sexual violence were not just about individual acts of cruelty. They were also a way for elite white women to assert their dominance over black bodies and reinforce the racial hierarchy that underpinned the institution of slavery. By dehumanizing and degrading black men, they further solidified their own position of power within the system. What new insights have you gained about the roles white women played in the slave economy, and how does this change your perception of history? Slavery's psychological distortion and the racial hierarchy. The institution of slavery in the United States persisted for over 400 years, leaving a deep imprint on countless generations. It established a distorted social order, a system that allowed white Americans to dominate nearly every aspect of life. This wasn't just about forced labor, it was about controlling, dehumanizing, and terrorizing black communities. White authorities used brutal methods like lynchings, physical beatings, and cruel punishments as tools of control, sowing fear to maintain power. But the oppression didn't end with violence. Segregation followed in almost every sphere. Black communities were kept apart in neighborhoods, housing policies were designed to exclude, and even the criminal justice system targeted black individuals unfairly. Racism seeped into the fabric of American society, creating generations of privilege and wealth for white families who benefited materially and socially from this rigid racial hierarchy. Physical abuse. Beyond the whip of the male slaveholder. While the image of the brutal white male slaveholder wielding a whip is deeply ingrained in our understanding of slavery, it's crucial to remember that violence within the system was not limited to men. White women, despite their perceived fragility and societal constraints, also participated in acts of physical brutality against enslaved black men. By 1830, slavery had become deeply entrenched in the Southern economy and society. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were forced to labor in a wide range of settings, from small farms to large plantations, in urban and rural areas alike. Regardless of the specific context, the underlying principle of slavery remained the same. Enslaved people were considered property, not human beings. This dehumanization was enforced through violence, both actual and threatened. While white men were often the primary perpetrators of physical abuse, white women also played a significant role in maintaining this system of violence. They held positions of authority within the plantation household and were responsible for overseeing the work of enslaved individuals. This power dynamic gave them the opportunity to inflict physical harm on enslaved black men, often without fear of consequences. Their acts of brutality ranged from whippings and beatings to other forms of corporal punishment. These acts left lasting physical and psychological scars on the enslaved individuals who endured them. It's important to acknowledge this often overlooked aspect of slavery to gain a more complete understanding of the widespread violence that characterized the system. By recognizing the role of white women in perpetuating physical abuse, we can challenge the simplistic narrative that portrays them solely as passive victims. We must confront the uncomfortable reality that women, too, were capable of inflicting immense pain and suffering on others within the context of slavery. This understanding is essential for a more nuanced and accurate historical perspective. We must remember that the violence of slavery was not limited to a single gender or race. It was a systemic problem that permeated all aspects of Southern society, leaving a legacy of trauma that continues to impact us today. Reproducing slave society and maintaining control. What many people may not realize is that Southern households actively worked to reproduce the institution of slavery. Their goal was to secure more enslaved individuals while keeping costs low. In these environments, white children, both boys and girls, observed their parents exercising control over black servants and learned to imitate those behaviors. They became astute, strategic, and aware of the power dynamics at play. They understood exactly how to navigate and reinforce their privileged positions. The book, They Were Her Property, offers vivid illustrations of life in the antebellum South. For instance, the opening chapter recounts a striking incident involving a 3-year-old girl named Lizzie Anna Burwell, who boldly demands her father to mutilate a black servant's ears and procure a new maid for her. This was not an isolated occurrence. Fathers often gifted their daughters more enslaved individuals, further entrenching the notion of ownership. Women in the South were legally able to claim property, which included ownership of black servants. However, due to the coverture doctrine, married women were typically not recognized as property owners, as the law viewed them and their husbands as a single legal entity, with the husband as the primary figure. In Stephanie McCurry's Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War, this system of coverture is compared to the control that slaveholders exercised over their enslaved people. White women had limited legal rights, and their efforts to assert property claims often met with fierce resistance. Dr. Jones-Rogers highlights that while coverture imposed limitations on married white women, Southern families frequently found ways to circumvent these restrictions. Families could transfer property to daughters or other female relatives with the understanding that it would remain separate from any marital assets. In practice, Southern women established what we might recognize today as prenuptial agreements, alongside legal documents like deeds of trust and wills. These instruments allowed them to maintain control over property they already owned or would acquire during their marriages. In Louisiana, for example, women could petition the courts to create separate marital estates if their husbands mismanaged finances, such as overspending or accruing debt. This dual system revealed a complex reality in which a patriarchal society coexisted with a legal framework that granted white women considerable financial and legal influence. While the overarching power structure was undeniably male-dominated, women navigated these constraints with cunning and resourcefulness, demonstrating their ability to wield power within the confines of a society built on exploitation. Unveiling the truth. Interviews with formerly enslaved people. Historically, many scholars believed that white women didn't play a significant role in the institution of slavery. This perspective was largely shaped by a limited number of writings from a small group of Southern white women. However, Dr. Jones-Rogers, an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, took a different approach. She turned to a powerful source: interviews with formerly enslaved individuals, which provided authentic insights into their experiences during slavery. One poignant example comes from the Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, where these interviews were conducted. One former enslaved person reflected on the harsh realities of their upbringing, saying, "We've been slaves all our lives, and mother was a slave, sister, father was a slave. They know nothing about read, write, all that. I know they teaches mine." This testimony highlights how deeply entrenched the legacy of slavery was within families. Another former enslaved individual recounted the dire living conditions, stating, "Other people didn't have no beds when they was slaves. They all slept on the floor. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't all it look in no book." These voices provide a clearer understanding of the complexities of slavery, revealing how it permeated both the lives of the enslaved and the everyday realities of white women involved in the system. How can understanding the complexities of power dynamics during slavery help us in our ongoing fight for racial equality today? The market for enslaved wet nurses. White women wielded significant influence in shaping a distinct market for enslaved wet nurses, which became a common practice in the antebellum South. You might wonder why these women felt compelled to separate black mothers from their families to nurse their children. The answer lies in the demands placed on white women themselves. Many of them experienced the relentless cycle of childbirth, often feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. One account even described these women as feeling like a slave in their own homes, burdened by the constant demands of caring for multiple infants. To alleviate this pressure, many white women turned to black women, purchasing or hiring enslaved wet nurses to take on the responsibilities of nursing and caring for their newborns. This arrangement allowed white mothers to reclaim their time and social lives, as they could attend events and engage in community activities while knowing their children were being cared for by someone else. The choice to employ an enslaved wet nurse not only underscored the harsh realities of separation for black families, but also highlighted the complex dynamics of power and privilege, as white women could exert control over both their own lives and the lives of those they enslaved. Please comment 1 to let me know you'll be watching this video until the end. The myth of the sheltered woman and the reality of the slave market. A pervasive myth exists that white women in the 19th century were sheltered and delicate, preserving their homes from the harsh realities of the outside world. However, this notion is far from accurate. In fact, numerous accounts from slave traders, travelers, merchants, city officials, and formerly enslaved individuals paint a different picture, revealing the active involvement of white women in the slave markets of that era. During the height of slavery, many white women participated in the buying and selling of enslaved people, often doing so from the comfort of their own homes. These transactions frequently occurred within local social networks, where women leveraged their connections to engage in the slave market. This reality contradicts the stereotype of women as passive observers of a system they benefited from. Instead, they played an integral role in sustaining the institution of slavery, making decisions that impacted the lives of those they enslaved and reinforcing the social and economic structures that supported the system. Martha Washington. When people think of George Washington, they often remember that he owned slaves who worked at his Mount Vernon estate. But fewer people realize the significant role his wife, Martha Washington, played in expanding the enslaved population there. When they married in 1759, George owned around 18 enslaved people, while Martha arrived with a staggering 84 enslaved individuals. This number may seem unusually high, but the fact that Martha owned enslaved people was not uncommon. Like her, many white women actively engaged in the slave trade and held substantial power over those they enslaved. In fact, owning enslaved people was often seen as an advantage for white women looking to secure a favorable marriage, as wealth in enslaved individuals was attractive to potential husbands. After marriage, these women frequently went to court to retain legal control over their slaves, and many were successful. For white women of that era, the institution of slavery ironically represented their own form of economic and social freedom, providing a path to independence and influence in a society that otherwise offered them few rights. Brutality and brothels. The brutality that some white women inflicted upon their enslaved individuals was shocking, with instances of violence so severe that their husbands sometimes had to intervene to restrain them. This cruelty was particularly pronounced among wealthy women, who often saw the enslaved not just as property, but also as a means to an end. These women invested in both enslaved men and women, compelling them to reproduce in order to increase their holdings of enslaved people. Take, for instance, the case of Henrietta Butler, who faced a harrowing existence as she was coerced into sexual relations with enslaved black men to bear children. Once she gave birth, she was then forced to nurse the child of her mistress. Unfortunately, Henrietta's experience was far from unique. Many enslaved women endured similar fates as they were subjected to the brutal realities of their circumstances. The legacy of slavery. By the time we reached 1860, the landscape of slavery in the Americas was stark, with the United States holding nearly half of all enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere, approximately 4 to 6 million individuals. According to the 1860 census, 393,975 white individuals owned nearly 4 million black individuals, which represented just about 1.5% of the white population. Although slavery officially ended in 1865, the trauma endured by African Americans extended far beyond their enslavement. The aftermath brought shattered hopes for equality and acceptance, especially during the turbulent years of the 1880s and 1890s, as prevailing attitudes about race shifted dramatically. As the Civil War approached and the prospect of emancipation loomed, many white women who were slave owners reacted defensively. They often made it known to Union authorities that they remained loyal, resisting the changes brought by the war. In fact, some women even sought financial compensation from the government when slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. Others were determined to retain their property, resorting to strategies like refugeeing, where they relocated their enslaved individuals away from war-torn areas to maintain control. When the Civil War concluded, the dynamics shifted, but the control did not dissipate. Many white women engaged in negotiations regarding labor conditions with freed black individuals, often trying to retain authority over young African Americans by taking their children on as apprentices. While apprenticeship offered a glimmer of improvement compared to outright slavery, it still fell short of true freedom. Many ex-slaves found themselves working under the same masters or mistresses, often for meager wages and under strict terms. W.E.B. Du Bois poignantly captured this reality, noting that a freed person might stand a brief moment in the sun, only to be pushed back towards slavery, a brief reference to the temporary progress made by black communities in the Freedmen's Bureau in establishing schools and social support. However, this progress was swiftly undermined by the white Southern elite, including many white women. They enacted laws known as the Black Codes, designed with the intent to reinstate the obligations and restrictions of slavery. These codes effectively stripped black individuals of their voting rights and barred them from serving on juries or in state militias. In response, white men and women crafted a complex web of laws, such as contract and vagrancy laws, that created a system of control reminiscent of slavery. This led to the rise of peonage, a form of involuntary servitude based on alleged debt. By 1915, several states that had once relied on slavery had passed laws that allowed them to compel black individuals to work against their will. For instance, if someone was convicted of vagrancy, they could be forced into the convict lease system, a practice that generated significant profits for the wealthy white populace who profited from the labor of these convicted individuals. In this way, the legacy of slavery persisted, transforming rather than disappearing, embedding itself deeply in the social and economic structures of American life. The Horrors of Madame Lalaurie, a case study in extreme cruelty. The story of Madame Marie Delphine. Lalaurie stands as a chilling reminder of the depths of depravity that can exist within the human heart, particularly when fueled by unchecked power and racism. Her name has become synonymous with cruelty and sadism, a stark example of the horrific extremes to which the abuse of enslaved people could reach. Madame Lalaurie was a prominent socialite in 19th century New Orleans, known for her wealth and lavish lifestyle. However, behind the facade of elegance and refinement lurked a dark secret: the systematic torture and abuse of the enslaved people she owned. Accounts of her cruelty are truly horrifying. It's important to note that these are not simply rumors or exaggerations. The discovery of a hidden torture chamber in her mansion following a fire in 1834 confirmed the horrific truth of her crimes. Rescuers found enslaved people chained and mutilated, bearing the marks of prolonged and unimaginable suffering. The public outcry following the discovery of Lalaurie's torture chamber was immense, leading to a mob attack on her home and her eventual escape from New Orleans. While she was never brought to justice for her crimes, her story serves as a powerful indictment of the brutality of slavery and the unchecked power wielded by slave owners. History is more than dates and events. It's the lives, struggles, and resilience of those who came before us. Their stories deserve to be remembered and shared. If this journey through the past resonated with you, be sure to explore more in this series. Don't forget to subscribe and share Who Remembers with others who appreciate history's untold stories. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything. As always, thank you so much for watching.